Hello and welcome to a Spark AR tutorial. In this video we're going to be returning to looking at particles and how we can create image sequences alongside how we can create layered emitter occlusion essentially. So as always I'm just going to start from scratch, so I'm going to just create a new project. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start from the very beginning, obviously. So I'm going to just full screen this. So what we're going to want to do is we want to try and achieve a result that is not too dissimilar to this. So this is a effect that we're trying to go for, where we have the user here who is segmented from the background, and these little emitters or smiley icons are basically controllable by the screen tap, but are also hidden behind the user. That is essentially all we're after today. We obviously can go further with it if you want to, but this is just a sort of very nice introduction into occlusion, layers and emitters. So first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to start with organization of my project. So I'm going to go over to my layers tab up here, and at the moment by default it always gives us one layer. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to, down here it says add layer, I'm just going to create two more layers. I'm going to call layer 0 our foreground, because this is actually our topmost layer, and the way to think of layers is like thinking of a cake. Our foreground is our icing, the thing you see first. Our mid layer or layer 1 is sort of the spongy bit underneath, and our layer 2, or I'm calling background, is the soggy bottom to our pet cake essentially. So I'm doing this now because this will help keep things ordered, because it's very easy to forget to actually order things and layer things, and always try and follow a good naming convention where you can. So with those three layers now created, they're currently not doing anything, but we've got to know that every time we create something we will have to assign it to one of these three layers that we're working with, and we could always add more if we wanted to make more complex effects. So first thing we want to do is we're going to want to separate our user from the background. So in order to do this, I'm going to go to add object. I'm going to add a rectangle. I'm just going to have to turn the fan on because the computer's going to start spinning up. So I'm going to add a rectangle. So this will create a canvas. So our canvas is our sort of UI window to our device. That's the topmost layer by default on all of our applications. And with this rectangle that's now created, you can notice that we have this small little checkerboard square is created in the center of our screen. We want this to fill our entire screen, so I'm going to go over to our properties window with our rectangle selected, click on the first value of 100 and change it to fill width, so that will fill our entire width of our screen. And likewise with the second value I want to change that to fill our height. So now we should have a checkerboard pattern that fills our entire view. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this rectangle 0 our user, because this will be our topmost layer and this will be where the user is actually cut out from the background essentially. In order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to go to canvas and I'm going to add a second rectangle, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to make sure it fills the width and fills the height, and I want to make sure that this rectangle, this new one, is our background layer. So our user is on our foreground and our second rectangle will be our background, and guess what we're going to call it? Yep, that's right, we're going to call it background. And so far we now have these two rectangles, both with checkerboards, doing absolutely nothing. So we need to assign materials to these. So I'm going to first start off with my user. I'm going to select my user rectangle, go over to the materials option under properties, and click on this little plus button. This will create us a new default material, or material 0 in this case, under our assets panel. I'm going to rename this material user so I don't get confused later on. And with this user layer selected, I want to first off change its shader type to be a flat, so it is not affected by the lights in our scene, our directional light or our ambient light, because we want this to be as the camera sees and captures things essentially. So what we have now is a white rectangle. So how do we get the data from what the camera is picking up as being the user and what the camera is picking up as being the background? Well, thankfully Spark AR actually does a lot of this work for us, and we simply click on our camera in our scene. We need to add some extraction options, so we need to click on texture extraction, the little plus button next to that, and that will create us a new camera texture. And we're going to go and click on the little plus button next to segmentation, and this will create us a person segmentation mask. And with these two things we'll be able to detect the user and cut them out from the background. And this is using the same masking techniques you'll find in most 3D modeling programs or Photoshop, where it's basically creating a black and white true or false mask, obviously, or cutout. And with these two new textures created, we need to assign these to our newly created user material. So I click on my user material, I go over to my diffuse texture, and I'm going to assign this to be camera texture. So this is now just a live feed from our camera flattened onto that rectangle. But as you can see, it still has got the background, it's still being captured and still being shown. So I need to go over to our shader properties and our little alpha button, which currently is grayed out. If I click on the little box to the side of it, this will enable our alpha option, and we just need to assign this alpha the texture of person segmentation mask. So now what we should have is our person should now be cut out, and we should see our checkerboard pattern for our background layer underneath, or behind in this case. So far so good. But what if our cutout was not correct or not perfect? Well, luckily, if we was to select our person segmentation mask, we actually have some options open to us. So I could increase, for example, the size of my mask, so it increases the radius of what is being cut out. So this is very good for people who may have very sticky out hair, or hair that's a little bit like wispy. So you may want to adjust it a little bit higher than you think. So I'm just going to return that to, I'm just going to keep that as is for now actually. Our second value here is our softness. So by default its softness is 100, so as is feathering. If I reduce this to 0, it gives a very sharp edges. So if I just maximize this to highlight that point, you can see how we have these very sharp edges shown around. Like so. And if I go back up to 100, these are now softened up a lot more. I'm just going to return this to 1.8, which is default cutout. And in fact, I might actually just pull it up a little bit more just to be on the safe side. So now we have our person cut out and our background layer shown, but we have nothing assigned to our background layer, so we can go back to our background layer in our scene, and we can actually assign a new material to it. So we want to go to materials plus create new material. So this is by default creates us this quite horrible grey or white essentially. I'm going to make sure this is also a flat material. I'm going to reduce its opacity a little bit, and I'm going to give it a coloured tint. Now so far you can't see anything actually really happening other than we've got a blue background, but if I was to enable my webcam for a second, like so, you can see that now the world behind me has got its blue tint. You will notice that it does have issues with detecting things like hands. It's especially with inbuilt webcams. This is not so much an issue if you have sort of a modern smartphone like a Android or an iOS. Newer phones, the higher the camera resolution, the better it is at cutting out the user from the background. but for the purposes of development I'm using the inbuilt webcam, which is not ideal, so it will be a bit fuzzier than it should be, and it will not be detecting as accurately as it will do in your final piece, so don't worry about that too much. So now we can sort of see how we have our foreground and background separated. But how do we get around to adding in some more jazzy kind of the interactive particles, essentially? Well, the way I went about doing this is I went to add object and I just added a new particle system, and I made sure that this was on our mid layer, because remember, we're wanting this to be behind the user but in front of the background. I'm going to change this type to be a line because I want it to run horizontally across our scene. I'm going to change its width to be about 1, for example. You can change that to how you see fit. So at the moment it's emitting these little cubes, which means there's no material assigned to them. I can adjust its sort of warm-up speed. I can adjust the speed and the rotation of these particles, the scale of them. So I could, let's say, have them scale from 0.01 to 1. I can increase their lifespan to be 2 seconds so they live for longer. I could give them a bit of a spin, so they could spin between 0 and 40 degrees. I can also exert some force on them, so if I was to add, for example, some drag, I could add some linear drag so they struggle so they don't go as high up before they get stopped. If I wanted these particles to emit the other way around, I can just simply go to rotation, and on the Y rotation rotate this 180 degrees. Oh no, I can rotate it on the Z axis, sorry, 180 degrees, and now we can have particles raining down, for example. But at the moment this is no good without any particles, images or materials assigned. So I'm just going to drag this particle emitter to the bottom for now, and with our particle system or emitter created, I'm going to click on the materials little plus button, create a new material. This new material I'm going to rename to be particles, and I'm just going to also rename the material 0, which is our background layer material, to be background, just so I'm aware and I don't forget later on. So this is where things start to differ from older versions of Spark AR. So in older versions of Spark AR you would be able to import an image sequence fairly easily. They have changed this in more recent builds, and I'm going to show you the new way of doing this. So under our assets panel we click on the add asset. We want to import from our computer. So what we have here is I've got 3 images here which are in sequential order, and by sequential order I mean they're named 01, 02, 03, so they're incrementing in number or name. All I'm going to simply do is just import icon 1, or our first frame essentially, and import this into our project. So this is import our icon 1 as a texture. With our icon 1 texture imported, you notice it exports in as a single texture type. If I click on type drop down and I change this to be a texture sequence, I now want to select the 3 frames I actually have, or 3 icons, like so, and click open. It's going to say I'm failing to import image 1 because I've already imported it. That's okay. So I now have my 3 images imported, and if I go to my particle system here and I select, say, click on drop down here, you notice I can't select my texture like you can with older versions. This is because in more recent versions of Spark AR you have to create an image sequence as an asset. So to do this I simply go to add asset. I want to add an animation sequence. So this will create a new animation sequence for us, and I'm going to call this just particle sequence or something to that effect. And with our particle sequence animation sequence now created and selected, I go to my options up here go to my texture, click on the drop down, and I can now select my 3 icons or 3 frames of my smiley face that I imported. So if I now bring that in like so, that is created imported. I can now go over to my particles and select my texture type as being our particle sequence, which is our animation sequence that we've just created. And now you can see we have our 3 frames now playing indefinitely at 25 frames a second on a loop, which is not ideal. So for example, I could drop this down to be 1 frame a second, but I actually want to have some control over these images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it as 25, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a patch for this. So with my particle sequence selected, I can simply click on the little circle or yellow arrow next to current frame. This will bring up our patch editor. So I'm just going to minimize this for a second. So this is brought in our particle sequence, our animation sequence option. So at the moment it's on current frame 0, so it freezes on its first frame. And at the moment it's doing nothing, so I need to add in some interaction or control. So if I right click anywhere in my patch editor, it brings up all the available options I have. So I could bring in every time my mouth opens, changes a frame, or every time I tap the screen, which is actually what I'm going to do. So I'm going to select every time I tap the screen, I want this to change this. So in order to do that, I'm going to click and drag from my tap handle just into the grey somewhere like that and release it. I'm going to type in the word counter, and I'm going to add a counter property. I'm going to change the maximum counter to be the number of frames in my sequence. So in this case I had 3 images, so I've got 3 frames in my sequence. And now every time that this is tapped, it's going to increase my counter by 1, and I'll just link my count to my current frame like so. And now if I go to my preview window, select simulate touch and tap the screen, every time I now tap the screen, you'll notice that it's changing between those 3 images that I have in my sequence. So you can sort of see how playing about with layers, and if we used to import more emitters and make sure that we keep the kind of conventions of our layers naming in a sort of order, how we can build quite complex effects quite easily. Just a few notes of warning. So if I go to my webcam for a second, you'll notice that if I go too far back, the camera will start to clip. So like about here for me, it starts to clip like here, so you can see the background and the particles showing up again. This to some degree, like I said before, is to do with my inbuilt webcam, which is of a certain quality. This won't necessarily be as immediately obvious on your device, but it is something to be aware of, that there is a clipping point on these devices. They are aimed to be sort of in handheld use largely, so you can't go too far with the effect in this regard. If I want to turn off the background just for a second, so I'm going to actually turn off the visibility in my background and just go back to my webcam for a sec. So yeah, so you can sort of see how I've built a very simple particle system. I'm not really played about too much with the options for the emitters, so you could always play about this in your own time. So I could adjust the birth rates, so I could have loads of them flying around. I wouldn't want to necessarily have too many, because this obviously is going to impact your performance and your frame rate. But yeah, you can play about with using this to create like autumnal leaves. You can use this to create rain, especially if you had another rectangle above the user view. You can create like a frame that basically is in front of the segmentation. So it's about thinking outside the box largely, trying to play about with what works and experiment. So this has just been an amendment to an earlier video that I have done. So if you've watched the previous version, it's still largely relevant, except for obviously the changes that I've shown you with the image sequence and the fact that the layers no longer have a shader property type anymore. So I've been Stephen Fisher, thank you for watching. If you have any queries or comments, please leave them below, and remember to like, share and subscribe if you like what I'm doing, because I'm only doing this for you guys. Thank you very much.